Welcome, everyone. My name is Kira Bradford, and I am co-PI and technical lead of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the 7th installment in our Figshare webinar series. Today's webinar is called Open House for HEAL Data, Discussions with HEAL Recommended Repositories, and we'll focus on sharing newly developed repository resources and also hearing from representatives of 3 participating repositories: Vivli, NIMH Data Archive, and Figshare. This webinar will consist of a brief presentation followed by a moderated panel discussion, and then a live Q&A. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We are joined today by Anna Van Gulik of Figshare, Daniel Janes of NIMH, and Julie Wood and Rebecca Lee of Vivli. Dr. Anna Van Gulik is the government and funder lead and head of data review at the research repository Figshare. Anna received a PhD in psychology and cognitive neuroscience from Vanderbilt University in 2014 and has worked on data management, data sharing, and open science practices and infrastructure for the past 8 years, including previously as faculty at the Carnegie Mellon University Libraries, leading their open science program and within the neuroscience research community. She joined Figshare in 2020, where she manages repository projects for the US federal agencies and public and private research funders, including NIH, and leads Figshare's data curation service supporting FAIR data and the Figshare Plus repository for large data sets. She is based in Seattle and enjoys helping researchers across scientific disciplines make their research more open and impactful. We are also joined today by Dr. Daniel Janes. Dr. Janes is a program lead for the NIMH Data Archive, or NDA, at the National Institute of Mental Health. Prior to moving to NIH's NIMH in November 2021, he managed the NIGMS portfolio on population genetics and evolution, as well as K99 postdoctoral awards and the MIDAS Modeling Network. Dr. Janes earned his PhD in zoology from the University of Florida. We are also joined today by Julie Wood. Julie is the Senior Director at Vivli. She is responsible for operations, including supporting members and researchers' data archiving, access, and analysis on the Vivli platform. She is also a co-chair of the NIH Generalist Repositories Ecosystem Initiative, also known as GRAY, Competition Working Group. Prior to joining Vivli, Julie served as the head of communications and external affairs at the Cochrane Collaboration and the director of corporate communications at Oxfam GB, in addition to working for a Microsoft partner. Also with us today is Rebecca Lee, PhD. Rebecca is the executive director of Vivli and on faculty at the Center for Bioethics at the Harvard Medical School. Previous to her current role, she was the executive director of the MRCT Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard for over 5 years and remains a senior advisor at the center. She has over 25 years of experience spanning the entire drug development process with experience in biotech, pharma, and CRO environments. She completed a fellowship in 2013 in the Division of Medical Ethics at Harvard Medical School. She earned her PhD in chemical and biomolecular engineering from Johns Hopkins University. And last but certainly not least, leading us through the webinar today is HEAL steward Alex Waldrop. Dr. Alex Waldrop is the senior bioinformatics and machine learning scientist in the Genomics, Bioinformatics, and Translational Research Center at RTI International. He also serves as the data engagement lead for the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. A computer scientist by training with a PhD in bioinformatics and more than 10 years of experience in big data analytics, his work focuses on leveraging the power of machine learning to solve real-world problems across the biological, environmental, and social science domains. His scientific background includes various applications of high-throughput sequencing data to biological systems, including projects in microbiomics, population genetics, cancer genomics, transcriptomics, and statistical behavioral genetics. His computational background has focused largely on leveraging natural language processing techniques to improve data findability and harmonization through the development of tools like DUG, a semantic search engine for biomedical data sets developed for the NHLBI's Biodata Catalyst platform. And with those set of introductions, I will now pass it over to Alex to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Kira. Really excited to be here today, and I'm glad that everyone could make it. I want to start off with some objectives today. Broadly, I have 3 goals for today's webinar. First, I'd like to refresh and revisit the role of data repositories in the HEAL data ecosystem. If you'll call way back to webinar number 2, actually, finding a home for your HEAL data, we're going to pick off kind of where we left off there. Second goal I'd like to talk about today is that I'd like to unveil the official HEAL repository selection list. And then finally, I'd like to learn more about the data submission process across the exemplar HEAL repositories that we have represented today. So without further ado, let's dive in. So as many of you know, HEAL investigators are required to share at least some of their data, which is fantastic because by the time that HEAL gets going in aggregate, it will comprise a remarkably diverse portfolio of research data, with more than 20 data types being generated across more than 700 distinct studies. These data types range from things like genomics, neuroimaging, to clinical trials data. So it's a remarkable data set in both breadth and its depth. Next. So as we talked about in that second webinar, the goal of the HEAL data ecosystem is to provide access to those data generated across these studies by making them searchable, interoperable, and accessible to the broader research community. Next. And the main way we'll be making these data findable and accessible is through the HEAL platform. So the HEAL platform is being designed to provide exactly that functionality. And when completed, the platform will be a state-of-the-art portal for search and analysis across these more than 700 data generating projects. But here's the caveat. The HEAL data platform won't actually store any data. Next. You heard that correctly. The HEAL platform will not actually house any data. So as opposed to creating a monolithic database to host this massive data set that we've just talked about generating, we plan to host data across a number of existing domain-specific repositories that best know how to deal with these data types already. So in the last webinar, we talked about the cable TV analogy. And much like the way cable TV bundles shows across different channels, the HEAL platform will provide centralized access to HEAL data that's actually stored across data repositories specializing in subdomains, in things like clinical data, neuroimaging, genomics, mouse data. Next. So at the point of beating a dead horse, just to highlight this, there is no central HEAL repository. The HEAL platform will actually be a portal that aggregates information across more than 20 data types, making it searchable through a single portal. Next. So the practical question I'm sure you're asking yourself is, how can I make my data findable and accessible through the HEAL platform? I'm here to answer that. The simple answer is to pick a repository from the vetted list that we're introducing today, called the HEAL Stewards Repository Selection Guide. Next. This list was designed to make choosing a repository even more simple. So building on the selection principles that we outlined in the Finding a Home for Your Data webinar, we've decided to make the choice of choosing a repository even easier by providing a curated list. Next. Before we dive into that list, let's take a 20,000-foot view of the repo selection guide itself. So first and foremost, you can access the selection guide on the healdatafair.org website via the link we're showing here. In terms of the list itself, in total, it includes 26 data repositories cutting across multiple research subdomains, which we'll talk about in a second. In its current form, the list is ordered approximately by relative preference, which is great because it means that choosing the best repository for your data will often mean just starting at the top of that list and moving down until you found a repository to which you're eligible to submit your data to and that you think fits your data well. Next. Now let's take a deeper look at the actual list itself. To make things even simpler, we've gone ahead and grouped repositories on our list into the 10 high-level domains you've seen here. We'll go through each of these domains and point out the exemplar repos from our list that fall into each bucket. Next. Previous. There we go. So our first repository category is IC or NIH program-specific repositories. And these are repositories that are usually directly funded through an NIH IC and may only be available in some cases to projects that are funded through those same ICs. These are repositories like the NIMH Data Archive, who's here today, the NIDA CTN, the NIDDK Central Repo, NADAP, NICHD-, and NINDS Data Share. Generally, as a rule of thumb, if you are eligible to submit data to a funding IC's repository, and it's a good conceptual fit for your data, we recommend using these repositories. Next, we have our controlled access repositories. And these are repositories that are intended to be used by clinical trials or other studies that produce sensitive data that require some level of access control. For these types of data and studies, we recommend submitting your data to Vivli, who we'll also hear about from today. Next, we have our generalist repositories. So generalist repositories are a great option for data that don't fit neatly into any other subdomain. Officially, we recommend any of the generalist repositories funded through the NIH Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, which Kara mentioned earlier. And these include Figshare, Vivli, Harvard Dataverse, Dryad, the Open Science Foundation, and Mendeley Data. We actually even recommend some generalist repositories that are not supported through the GREI, which includes Open ICPSR. Next are recommended repositories for HEAL imaging data. So for data sets like human neuroimages or functional MRIs, we recommend users deposit data into the NIMH Data Archive, or the NDA, who we'll hear about later. For non-human imaging, like mice, we recommend images be submitted to Open Neuro. Next. For qualitative data, we recommend the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. Next, we have omics data. So most of the omics data generated through HEAL studies will be genomics, transcriptomics, and some metabolomics projects. So for these data types, we recommend users submit genomics and transcriptomics data to dbGaP, otherwise known as the database of genotypes and phenotypes, and metabolomics data to the metabolomics workbench. Next, we have organism-specific repositories, and typically you'll know if one of these fits your data because you'll be generating data from these model organisms. These are repositories that specialize in one or more non-human model organisms. So things like the mouse phenome database, rat genome database, mouse genome informatics, and the zebrafish model organism database. These are all great fits for the very specific type of data that some HEAL studies may be producing. Next. For projects working on machine learning models, we recommend submitting training data sets to Zenodo. Next. This is a little more related to code, but any code or software produced through HEAL projects, we recommend be deposited into GitHub. Next. And then finally, we recommend any lab or treatment protocols be deposited into protocols.io. Next. So that's it. That is the official HEAL Stewards Repository Selection Guide list. Stories we think create an excellent opportunity for people in the studies to deposit their data into. And at the end of the day, the goal of this is to empower you to choose any repo off this list that you best thinks fits your data. And ultimately, you're going to be the best one to decide where your data should end up. Next. So now that I've introduced the official list, we want you to feel confident in making a decision on where to submit your HEAL data. Should you have any other questions, we've invited representatives from 3 repositories likely to feature heavily in the HEAL data ecosystem to help us understand a little bit more about the data submission process. Before we jump into our panel, I want to briefly introduce the repositories represented on our panel. Next. First, we'll be featuring the NIMH Data Archive, otherwise known as the NDA. The NDA is a repository funded through the National Institute of Mental Health for collecting data on mental health in human subjects. Their data types range from phenotypic to imaging and neural signal, as well as genomic and pedigree information. Importantly, the NDA is our recommended home for data sets that include human neuroimaging data. On the data submission side, to contribute data to the NDA, you'll be asked to create a data submission agreement with guidance from NDA curators. And in terms of secondary access to your data, users will have to submit a data access request that will be scrutinized by the NDA Data Access Committee. So good levels of access control there. Next. Next, we'll be hearing from Figshare as well. And Figshare is an extremely flexible generalist repository that hosts data and really research products of any type, up to and including data, code, presentations, any documents that you feel are relevant. An important caveat here is that Figshare provides open access to all public files and metadata, and that feature may be appropriate for some projects, but not others. And then up to 20 gigabytes, you use Figshare, but then you can go over that using Figshare Plus for any data sets. And as we mentioned a couple times before, Figshare is part of the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, or GRAE. Next. And finally, we'll be hearing from Vivli today. Broadly, Vivli is a managed access repository for human individual participant level data. So because of this, Vivli is the official HEAL Stewards recommendation for controlled access data, including clinical trials that aren't eligible for an IC or program-specific repository. And one of the great things is that Vivli will aid investigators in executing on their data sharing agreements, and they also provide managed access to secondary data users, similar to NIMH Data Archive. So, next. And next. Now we'll invite our panelists to join us, and I'll ask them to turn on the cameras, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll be opening the floor to questions now. I'm going to start off with a few canned questions just to pick people's brains, but we'll go in order here. So without further ado, let's dive in and learn more about these repositories. So I'm going to start off with a question for everybody. And that is, can you please describe the process of registering for and submitting your study data into your repository? And another sub-question there is, can you pre-register metadata and can you reserve DOIs? So I'm going to kick this to Daniel from the NDA first.
Sure. So the first step of interacting with the NDA is to submit a data submission agreement. This explains the personnel that will be involved with submitting or taking data from NDA, what the purposes are, and the name and signature of a business official from your institution. After that data submission agreement is signed and submitted and accepted, there's an interaction between the user and an NDA data curator. And the data curator will help you set up what we call data structures. So these are like shells into which the data can be poured. So if a project is ongoing, those shells can be revisited over and over and more data can be poured into them. And those structures include the metadata, and that's what can be shared across laboratories for a harmonization effort, which is one of our main goals.
Fantastic. Anna, can you tell us a little about the data submission process at Figshare?
Yeah, sure. Glad to. Thanks for having us join today. So Figshare is a freely available repository. Really, all you need to do is go to figshare.com, create a free user account, sign up with your email, sync your ORCID ID, and then you can start uploading your files and creating metadata. And on figshare.com, you can really publish it as quickly as you would like to. So you can save items for a while as drafts. You can share them with collaborators in projects if you'd like. But if you want to upload it that day and publish it the next hour, that's also available to you. So good if you're in a rush in that sense. You just need to fill out all the required metadata. And we certainly encourage you to be as complete and thorough as you can there so someone can find and reuse the data set. You can create the metadata in advance and hold on to the items. So you can reserve a DOI for any item in advance. This will go live once you publish it. So you can get that DOI and put it in a manuscript and not worry about what it will look like later. You could also publish the item with an embargo on it. So you could put an embargo on either the entire item, meaning the files and the metadata, or on just the files. If you use the embargo just on the files, then the item page and the metadata will go live and the DOI will go live. So this could be useful for perhaps like a copy editor checking that the DOI is there in your data availability statement of a paper. But then you could keep an embargo on the files until the day the paper is published or something like that. Then just go in, revise the item and republish it without the embargo. With Figshare Plus, we do check the files and do some checks on the metadata. Sometimes ask for revisions to make the metadata a little bit more thorough. So with Figshare Plus, the full time from requesting to publish on the platform, this is for large data sets over 20 gigabytes up to many terabytes. By the time you request the data publishing, get an account on that repository and then upload the data sets and have them checked. Could be about a week, 2 weeks, kind of depending how quickly you upload these large files and make revisions.
Thanks, Anna. All right, I want to hear now from Julie and Rebecca from Vivli about their data submission process.
Great, yeah, I'll take this one, Rebecca. So in terms of how you submit and get ready to share your data on Vivli, basically just go to our website. We have a page called How to Share Your Data. If you could pop that in the chat so people can look at that. It walks you through every step of the process, which is really very simple. You fill out a very brief form, and then the Vivli team will work with you to move forward and manage kind of any agreements or whatever is needed from your institution to then get that up and available. In terms of DOIs, yes, you can, once you fill out that form, we can get the metadata listed for you. And then that will provide you with the DOI that you can use in publications, et cetera, for future. And on Vivli as well, you can embargo your data for when it's going to be available and do that upfront in advance. But we'll just help you every step of the way to make it, we really work hard to make it as easy as possible to make the sharing as simple as it possibly can be on Vivli.
Thanks, Julie. Great answers all around. Next, I wanted to ask a little bit about the cost. What is the cost of submitting data or getting data from your repositories? And then are these prices transparently available for including in a proposal that I want to include? I'll just kick it back to Julie on that note, or Rebecca from Vivli.
Sure, I can take that. It's a really good question. So for academic researchers, there's no cost to submit, to request data, put in a proposal, to access data, or if they want to submit data for archiving, there's no cost for that as well. All of this is transparent on our website, vivli.org, and certainly everything is transparent on our website. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Dan? Go ahead, sorry.
About the cost. There's no cost to the user of interacting with NDA. There is, of course, a cost to the data sharing effort in terms of time and FTEs. And there is a tool on the NDA website that helps people calculate what that cost is, taking into consideration what kinds of data they're collecting, how many hours it will take to get it into shape for submission to NDA. That tool is available on our website, and it helps people calculate the cost of this in order to write it into future grant applications.
Awesome. Anna, same question to you.
Yeah, sure. So Figshare.com has always been a free resource and will remain a free resource. So on Figshare.com, it's free to upload data and it's always free to access the data. It's a fully open access repository. People don't actually even need a user account to download data sets. They can be freely downloaded by any user or via the API. And the metadata that's published is all licensed CC0, and the items that are published, licensed according to the selected license. So that is freely available for data sets up to 20 gigabytes at a time, which could include a single file up to 20 gigabytes as well. But we have in the past few years found more and more requests from researchers who have larger data sets to share. And we tried to help them out as much as we could, to get, support requests and say, I have an 80 gigabyte data set, I have a terabyte data set, I have a 9 terabyte data set to share. But from a sustainability perspective for us, it was hard to offer those for free because we're paying for the redundant cloud storage and saving those, over many, many years. So that's why we launched Figshare Plus last fall as a repository resource for those larger data sets. So for that, there is a one-time data publishing charge. And those are transparently listed on our Plus website. So researchers can plan ahead for that. The data publishing charge is tiered based on the storage that you need, and then includes a small review fee. So those begin at $395 for a 100 gigabyte data set and go up to basically as many terabytes as you need, the single file limit there being 5 terabytes, just imposed by the cloud storage limits that we have. But we would encourage researchers, if they have larger data sets, to build that in. And we're thinking about curation needs that, support needs that researchers might have even for smaller data sets as well. But right now we're offering that for bigger data sets.
Thanks, Anna. I'll come right back to you with a question. What is the typical amount of time that it takes for a study to go through your registration and submission process?
Yeah, so I answered this a little bit at the beginning, jumped ahead, but it's pretty quick with Figshare.com. It's as quick as you'd like, 10 minutes, 2 hours, as quickly as you can write your good metadata. If you have it ready, from your pipeline, it will be an easy process. If it's your first time sharing data, it might take a few hours to get everything together and well documented, or even days, depending how complex your data set is. But that's really all up to you as the researcher. Our moderation of Figshare.com is at the moment just for spam or misuse of the platform. And then for Figshare Plus, the process is submitting a data publishing request. We'll review it within just a couple of business days to make sure it's appropriate for the repository. Just checking that it can be published, that you have the rights to publish it and things like that to make it fully open access. Then we'll give you an account and you can upload it. So the turnaround's a week or 2 weeks probably. But sometimes researchers will start that process and then it'll actually be about 10 months because they don't actually want the data set published the next day. This is kind of a long-term goal. So you actually have a full year to publish on Figshare Plus as well, if you would like to take that time between starting the process and making it go live.
Fantastic. Julie and Rebecca, I want to ask the same question about typical timelines for Vivli submissions.
Sure. So from starting putting in the form, it usually takes about a week, then five business days really to get that metadata listed. And then, as quickly as agreements are signed after that, you can then upload your data and share it. But as soon as the metadata is up, researchers can start to request that data and then it'd be shared if after embargo period or when the data is ready. But generally, to get the metadata up, it's about 5 business days.
Perfect. Dan?
So a lot of our users are continuing users. They set up the data structures and then they make a data submission every 6 months for the duration of a research project. So sharing happens at the end of a project period or after a paper is published. If the data are already all collected, so that this will not be an ongoing relationship, instead everything is already in the PI's hands and is ready to be submitted, it can be much faster than that. still have to go through the process of getting the data submission agreement approved, the data expected established, those data structures, and then the data submitted and accepted. So that can take a week or two. So there's variables involved in when those data retrospective will be ready to be shared.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, now I have a question about, let me see how to phrase this. Can you describe your controlled access mechanisms? So are there like multiple tiers or level of access? You know, could things be wide open? Could things be locked down? What options do people have to play with at your various repositories for access control? I'll start with Dan.
So within the data archive, there are multiple permission groups, and permission groups consists of many collections. So each project has a collection into which they put all of their data. So the different labs collections all sit together in a permission group, and access to a permission group is considered and given or denied all at the same time. So you ask for maybe you're interested in one collection in particular, but you will get access to an entire permission group. And the permission group is protected by a data access committee, which considers the requests and makes recommendations about whether or not to allow the access to take place. So the only thing that we have that is open access is a repository from NIMH on osteoarthritis. Everything else considers DAC requests, data access committees.
Thanks, Dan. Julie and Rebecca, I'm interested to hear more about the access controls at Vivli. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I can talk a little bit about that. The study level data or metadata are considered open access. There are some studies that make their study documents open access as well. That might include the protocols or the data dictionaries. And you know, the researchers can come in and download those as well for selected data sets. The IPD level information is under what we call controlled access, and each of the data contributors can decide what level of controlled access they require. In general, all the data is under, you know, of course, a data use agreement, which is one level of access control. We also require specific expertise to access the data. And then each data set, data contributors can decide whether there is a review process that is required to access the data. And there are different levels of review that may or may not be required to access each data set. So those are kind of the levels of gatekeeping that we have at Vivli that is required to access the data.
Thanks, Rebecca. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about access controls and the options we have at Figshare?
Yeah, sure. So among these, Figshare is going to be the most open of the repositories. So for making things really broadly open, one of our missions is to make things as open as possible. But of course, sometimes things have to be closed. So as closed as necessary is also part of that. And so the embargoes are really the biggest way that Figshare.com users can restrict access to published items. You can also keep items unpublished and share them just with collaborators, but that won't give you a live DOI or anything like that. So in terms of making the metadata public, but restricting access to the files, the best bet would be to use that embargo. You can set a reason for the embargo and explain why it's there, you know, how to contact you or something like that. The embargo, however, doesn't allow you to grant access to a specific user by request. So one way that you could do that is to use our private link sharing functionality. So you can generate a private link to any item, draft or public, and then you can share the link with a specific individual. Really, anyone with the link anyone with the link will be able to access the files and the metadata. And so this does blind the author's names. So it could be helpful in a peer review setting to include in a manuscript. You could use the private link function and then change to the DOI in the manuscript or the publication later. or you can use it when people request access to a private data set to share the private link with them. And our private link functionality is something on our development roadmap that we're going to be expanding in the next year or two, such that you can actually have multiple private links and you can set them to expire or expire them. So you could hand out access to specific items. That's about the limitations of the controlled access for Figshare.com and Figshare Plus. For the infrastructure that we run for organizations that use Figshare for institutions, there are quite a few more options for restricting access by IP range, logged in users, specific groups. There's a request access workflow that would send an access request to the author or a repository administrator, but it's not something that we have on the free repository at this time.
Thanks, Anna. I have a question for Vivli. We'll start off with Vivli. What are there resources that you'd like people to be aware of as they prepare to submit their data to Vivli?
Yeah, so we have a really rich set of resources for how to share your data, as well as how to access the data. They're all kind of how-to guides and I see the link just got put in the chat, which is great. And it walks you through a step-by-step process of everything that you can use. There's also a draft language you can use if you have a publication and you want to share your underlying data on Vivli, and how to meet the kind of IC and JE requirements, plus other templates and tools that you can use as you're thinking about preparing your data for use in Vivli, and it's all on that website.
Fantastic. And as Julie mentioned, we've just dropped a link in the chat, everyone there, and I'm sure we'll get some more links too, so just keep an eye on those. Anna, what resources would you like people to be aware of as they are submitting to Figshare?
Yeah, similarly, I would point to our help sites. So we have a help page and a knowledge portal site, and thanks for the links. There they are. So on our help page, you can look for guides and tutorials that range everything from just how to get started and upload files to using the API. And you can also search there for some NIH specific guides that I've created. So we have one for uploading NIH funded data that will kind of give you some tips, say, about entering your funding information according to add NIH awards and grants in a way that links out directly to those grants in the Dimensions funding database, our sister company. You can look there also for guides about how to include Figshare in a data management and sharing plan, and how to plan for costs for data sharing and things like that. There's some template language to include in a DMSP that you could find there as well. And then there's webinars that we have recordings available for. So we've actually been doing a lot of webinars, and we will be doing more as part of the GRAY initiative, both individually and in collaboration with other generalist repositories partaking in GRAY. So I'm actually chairing the training subcommittee for the GRAY initiative, and there's going to be a great calendar that will be publicly available that will list all of the webinars and training events across the 6 GRAY repositories. We'll be putting together a webinar series of trainings together with multiple repositories, and then also hosting a workshop aimed at the research communities using generalist repositories, together with discipline specific repositories as well. How do they fit into your data sharing world? And that will be coming either end of this year or start of next year. So look out for that as well.
Awesome. Also, I love the synergy there of cross webinar talk promotional materials there. So this is like the Marvel Cinematic Universe of data sharing webinars. Dan, what resources would you like people to be aware of as they prepare to submit to the NDA?
The NDA has a help desk that is operating Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. And if you submit a question during those hours, you'll get a response very, very quickly. And the help desk has access to escalate your questions to a number of different experts, so we can get an informed response to you very soon. NDA is a website. It's easy to find, and you can request an account, which will allow you to access more resources on the website, including webinars and tutorials. And there is a quarterly newsletter, which actually just went out a few minutes ago to about 25,000 users around the world, that gives information about what's going on in NDA, what's changing, how are policies changing, and how we respond to new policies.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear about all the content you all are developing to help users on their data sharing journey. So very exciting. I have one last question that I'd like to ask as part of the moderated panel before we open it up. But this one is just to Vivli and Figshare. This is about the recent generalist repository question. How do generalist repositories fit into the NIH HEAL data sharing landscape? What's your take on that? I'll start with Julie and Rebecca from Vivli.
That's a really great question. We feel like we have a core mission to supplement the domain repositories that are specialized and really so important to optimize access for NIH funded data. We at Vivli really hope to work with HEAL researchers and others that don't have an obvious domain or specific repository to archive and share data. Some HEAL researchers might have specific privacy concerns, as they may have human data to share or require the expertise of a repository that specializes in this area. We're certainly happy to work with you on some of these issues, and we have a deep experience in this area, and also adhering to the FAIR data principles.
Fantastic. Anna, you want to close us out here on the moderated panel? How do you see the role of the generalist repositories in NIH HEAL data sharing landscape?
Yeah, sure. This is really a very timely question as we're thinking about the new NIH policy. And the role of generalist repositories is something we've been working with NIH on for a few years now. We actually conducted a pilot repository with them in 2019 to 2020, where we, for about a year, ran a generalist repository for NIH funded work and explored what were those use cases, when were researchers turning to a generalist repository to share their work, both intramural and extramural researchers who will both be affected by the new data management sharing policy. And what I think we find is that while there are so many excellent discipline-specific repositories, including many funded directly by NIH or based at NIH, those offer really good data sharing for a specific type of data, specific methodology. But there's other data sets or even just other research outputs that require a bit more flexibility and where the domain-specific repository doesn't exist. So I think that's where generalist repositories really fill a gap in the data repository landscape of offering the flexibility to share other types of research outputs, whether that's code or workflows or other types of data sets, survey instruments. I mean, we were founded 10 years ago. Figshare is celebrating its 10th birthday now. Our founder was a genetics researcher who had lots of videos and images that couldn't go into journal supplemental information, but are actually a really valuable resource as an output of the research and could be used by someone else or of interest to others. And so that's why, we created Figshare so people could upload things like images and videos easily and get a DOI for them. So filling that gap there. So it's the balance of flexibility, but also still offering rigorous community standards of a data repository. So versus, sharing something with a link to Google or Dropbox or something like that, here you still have all of the rigorous data, metadata community standards, persistent identifiers, discoverability in search engines like Google Dataset Search, openly tracked metrics, citations, persistent DOIs. So you get all of those standards, but then the flexibility. So that's kind of the balance of how a generalist repository fits in. And I was just on a call this morning with someone at NIH about thinking about specifically use cases where the outputs of a specific research project would be in multiple repositories, which is a fine use case and really appropriate that certain types of data should go to certain repositories, but then they should just be well linked in the metadata. And so you can feel free to sort of use generalist repositories in concert with other repositories at the same time, even for the same work.
Thanks so much, Anna. These are some fantastic answers from you all to those questions. I think that you really helped flesh out our ideas of how your repositories can be of service to HEAL projects submitting data, and why each of your repositories made it onto the list. So we're really happy to have you. Okay, that ends the moderated section. So now let's go to the Wild West. Let's open it up for some questions, get some audience feedback here. So I'm just going to be kind of filtering through these and asking them as they come up to specific people. This first one, I'm going to put myself on the hot seat, actually. This is a great question. So is there a reason that data cannot be submitted to a university institutional repository not on the list? That's a great question. So first of all, let me give you some background into how the list was created. We narrowed these 26 down from over 104 repositories currently recommended by the NIH across all these different domains. And so the NIH had already done some diligence in creating a list of repositories that they found met certain criteria. So that's where we wanted to start from. So first of all, whether or not the institution's repository is on that list or not could factor into that. Another reason is we applied a set of selection principles to make sure that these data were going to be around for a long time. So we wanted to find places we knew that were well funded, and we knew that had long-term sustainability plans, and that also met certain technical criteria, such as APIs, to be able to interoperate with the HEAL platform itself. So the long answer and the short answer there is to say that there's no technical reason why it couldn't happen if it didn't meet, if that university institutional repository met all of these criteria. But these specific repositories, we feel, do a really good job at meeting those selection criteria and principles, and we know will interoperate with the platform itself. And this list is in flux. I think that things can be added depending on new gaps that may be perceived. This is a living document, and so we want to be in conversation with you all. So please contact the HEAL stewards if you feel like there are things that would be of help to the research community that would be nice if they were added to this list. So we're happy to interface with that. Okay. Second question here is, why are GEO and the SRA being the short read archive, not on your list? Why would training data sets go into Zenodo and not GitHub with the appropriate code? I'm going to answer these in reverse order. So training data sets typically are very large. You can save large training data sets on GitHub. It's just our practice has been so far to save these kind of large data sets on Zenodo, which is also a generalist repository. So they are a little bit more well set up for dealing specifically with data, as opposed to GitHub, which is more straightforward for versioning control and code. So there's an aspect of data curation there that we feel like we gain with Zenodo versus GitHub. As far as GEO and the short read archive, so for sequencing data, almost always we're going to want that to go to dbGaP because of the access controls that it provides, as long as that it is human data. If there are other sequencing projects that you're working on, we would also then, if they're not human, we would first ask that it go to a domain-specific repository if you're, say, doing mouse genomics, just because the types of metadata that they ask for will be very specific to domain, and it will be more interoperable and live alongside data from those same species. The SRA is certainly a fine repository, but we would ask that we look at the options that we have available for sequencing data before we branch off into a more generalist bucket for sequencing data. And as for GEO itself, I think, does anyone know off the top of their head what GEO stands for? I'll have to circle back with you on that. I'd like to have a little bit more information about GEO itself. So feel free to reach out to the HEAL stewards via the Slack channel, and we'll be happy to answer that question in more detail later. Okay, question 3. Where would one store methods for analyzing a drug compound that is commonly used? Such a document, such as a PDF, would be quite simple, but provide technical details. So methods for analyzing a drug compound, that would be a great type of information that you could put in, say, protocols.io. You could also put it in Figshare or any of the generalist repositories, as I understand as well. I think that it depends on whether this is more method, whether the methods are going to, are they the end goal of the project, or are they just something that you are using for reproducibility's sake, in which case maybe they could live alongside the data. In either case, that's a great question that the stewards can help you work through as you go and submit your data across these various repositories. All right, 4th question, also for me. Is there a cost for private companies, for example, provided by an SBIR, to submit data? Actually, this one's not for me. This is for everyone.
I'm happy to jump in on this one, Alex. For us, so we don't charge, individual PIs or researchers anything to submit data, but our business model is predicated on charging institutions like private companies funded by SBIR. They would have to be charged a modest amount. Other institutions like pharma or larger institutions like Harvard would also be charged an amount to be what we call members of Vivli, and we have close to 30, 40 members that are members, and we call them data contributors of Vivli that are part of our membership, and they are charged a cost according to their size and revenues.
That sounds great. Dan, Anna?
We don't charge individual collection users, but we do have a few memoranda of understanding with some institutions that are making a massive data submission. So that's not impossible, but generally speaking, we don't charge collection generators.
Yeah, I mean, our Figshare.com repository is open for all to use, including commercial entities. We just ask that it be scholarly work. And, certainly best practice would demand that you state who supported the work in the funding. So if it is conducted by, internal research funded by a company, best to disclose that in the metadata. And if you're using Figshare Plus, we would ask the same thing, as the reviewers of the data sets, that you disclose who supported the work. But there's not a prohibition as long as it's scholarly work or whatever. The pricing would be the same for academic researchers or for a commercial or small business group. I think really what you could cross into is our Figshare for institutions or Figshare for organizations infrastructure, which is often what our academic institutions, our funder clients, our pharmaceutical clients want to do, so that they can have their own Figshare portal that leverages all of our standards compliant infrastructure, but then they get to manage their own repository. They can assign user accounts, they can grant storage requests, they can do their own review of data sets, and they have their own landing page that captures, all of their research outputs that are still discoverable on Figshare.com and everywhere else, but showcase those results, allow them to look at metrics at the portal level. So there's a lot of added functionality there, and it makes sense for organizations that have many researchers sharing, perhaps to opt in for that, and build their own custom portal that can be fully customized for their use cases.
Thanks, Anna. These are some great questions. Here's another question. This one's for Vivli. Could Vivli describe a bit more how their controlled access works? For instance, what are the responsibilities of the data submitter to ensure that the terms of consent and data use limitations are sustained for the data set in Vivli? Also, who would be responsible for authorizing users for access? Vivli, the data submitter, or some other entity?
I love these multi-layered questions. Thank you. So let me take these one at a time and just a piece of this. I think we're running on time, and I'm happy to answer some of these afterwards. So in terms of the data submitter, they certainly are responsible for answering the consent form and making sure that they are compliant with the consent form. If there are questions, we certainly can walk them through that. And my background is clinical trials, and we are very familiar with these. Nowadays, broad consent is widely used for prospective clinical trials, and that language is usually used on a prospective basis. Most of the trials that we are getting now that are hitting us are trials that have been completed and planned quite some time ago, of course. Data use limitations are sustained. In short, data use limitations are sustained. I mean, that is something that we are, of course, working hand in hand with the data submitters, and that's something that we would be responsible for. And then authorizing users for access, that is our responsibilities as the gatekeepers. And one thing that the contributors are responsible for is giving us data that is anonymized. And so that is something in the data contribution agreement that the data contributor is responsible for. Hopefully I answered most of the questions in there. And if not, please feel free to reach out to us directly.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Here's one. From a repo perspective, is there any common discussion or strategizing on standards or enhancements to power federated search as data is cast to the four winds? That's very, I love that that creative verbiage there. I'm guessing here we're talking about, are repositories talking about common formats for study level metadata or data dictionaries or variable level metadata? What kinds of things, if any, have been done to power things like search across platforms?
It's really not that mature of a field yet. I mean, we're struggling with this within a platform. So within the NDA, we want people to reuse pre-existing data dictionaries. The problem is that research projects tend to be idiosyncratic. So the available data dictionaries might not work to present the data that a project has created. So the best thing that you can do is look at what's already available to use as a data dictionary before you jump into creating your own. Pre-existing data dictionaries can be edited. So if it's close but doesn't quite capture what you're doing, you can make small changes. But that is a very tricky thing to data harmonization, is getting data into the kind of framework in which it can be compiled across projects. It's very challenging.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to jump in here just to give a plug back to a couple webinars ago. The HEAL stewards and the HEAL platform are actually designing their own centralized study level and variable level metadata that both can be used as a supplement or to help fill out the study and variable level metadata that you may be asked to fill out at these repositories. But this will be a standardized thing that will be across all HEAL studies that will help make things findable and searchable on the platform itself. So the primary mechanism of searching across common features of HEAL projects is going to be accomplished through everyone filling out one of these forms for study level metadata and the variable level metadata, to which we have links in the chat right there. And with that, I want to say thank you all so much for everything. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kira. Thanks again to Vivli and the NDA and Figshare and their representatives for coming and talking with us today.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you all to thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar today. A very special thank you to our presenter, Alex Waldrop, and our panelists. We are very grateful to have in-depth insight into each of these 3 repositories. For the audience, we hope that you are leaving with a better understanding of HEAL recommended repositories and an increased motivation to select a repository for yourself to further expand the data available through the HEAL platform. So in addition to a recording of this webinar, we will also email everyone who is registered for this event a list of resources, including the links that were shared during this webinar, that will assist you as you participate more deeply in the HEAL ecosystem. The slide deck will be shared, and a link to our Slack channel and Connect with Us form will be located momentarily in the chat. We hope that you will reach out to us, the HEAL stewards, for questions or support as you embark on your FAIR journey to maximize the value of HEAL data. And finally, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on June 16th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This time we'll be focusing on de-identification of HEAL data. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.